Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg UK, a special focus on the biggest challenges facing the British government, the economy, financial services and markets. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, tax cuts were at the heart of the UK Chancellor Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement. There were some major giveaways, but the big picture has not really changed. The economy faces a rising tax burden over the coming years. Now, the measures also include a cut to national insurance for 27 million workers and a permanent tax break for corporate investment. Now, in total, the policy changes will provide a £21 billion stimulus to the UK economy in the run-up to the next election. And the Office for Budget Responsibility says the measures will boost growth by an average of just under 0.3% in the coming years. Now, the Chancellor insists his autumn statement will lead to growth in a country that has, quote, turned a corner.
We promised to halve inflation, and we have halved it. Headline inflation will fall to 2.8% by the end of 2024, before falling to the 2% target in 2025. The OBR expects the economy to grow by 0.6% this year and 0.7% next. After that, growth rises to 1.4% in 25, then 1.9%, 2% and 1.7% in 28. We reduce debt, cut taxes and reward work. I will therefore increase the local housing allowance rate to the 30th percentile of local market rents. This will give 1.6 million households an average of £800 of support next year. I have decided to freeze all alcohol duty until August the 1st next year. That means no increase in duty on beer, cider, wine or spirits. I'll invest a further £500 million over the next 2 years to fund further innovation centres to help make us an AI powerhouse. I'm going to go further and cut the main rate of employee national insurance by 2 percentage points from 12% to 10%. That change will help 27 million people. It means someone on the average salary of £35,000 will save over £450. The economy has grown. Rather than falling as predicted, real incomes have risen. Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done.
Well, joining us now is Jim O'Neill, former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management and Chatham House, now a member of the House of Lords. Thank you, Lord O'Neill, for joining us. When you look at the autumn statement, what was your big takeaway?
I'm a bit confused, to be honest, Fran. I think you need to get some more of your really policy and data-driven economists on to delve further. It's one of those budgets where I think it's a little bit dangerous to jump to an instant verdict, because there's quite a lot going on and being said. So the Chancellor, for example, again this morning, as he made a big deal out of yesterday, was saying his measures have been estimated by the OBR to boost growth by an accumulated 0.5% in the spring and yesterday, implying trend. And I can see why, because I think the investment tax allowance is being made permanent is a very welcome and sensible move, given the UK's woeful investment position. However, if you really delve into the book that goes with the statement and you quiz around, the OBR has actually reduced its trend growth forecast by about 1/10. And I'm not really sure how the two marry, although it might be, hence you getting more people on, something to do with the real oddity of, in between the spring budget and this one, of course, the ONS revised up the amount of GDP by 3% that they didn't think was there before. So the OBR probably thinks there isn't much capacity left in the economy either. But all that aside, which I think is really important stuff for the medium to long term, especially as to whether we can get inflation down permanently, it's a budget that's aimed at Tory principles and unifying the Tory party ahead of the election. And it's leaving grave challenges for public spending for whoever is in power going forward, as you implied with your comments.
But Jim, so basically, I mean, we understand that, this package of policies, A, would try to pull out the UK out of stagnation. So A, does it if it's successful. And two, it's also, trying to draw this clear dividing line with the opposition Labour Party as we get into the election year. Does that do the job?
Well, interestingly, on the latter, if I've seen the bits I've had a chance to of what the opposition front bench has said, quite sensibly, they agree with the investment tax cut allowance. And I think that's interesting politically, but it's also good because, as I've discussed with you many times before, the UK has a really dreadful position on the level of investment spending. And to prioritise trying to boost investment spending in the UK should be a priority for any sensible government going forward. Where there is some water between them is, I think, on the welfare and spending side. And obviously the Tories have introduced a more traditional Tory, tougher principle on that with what was announced yesterday. As to whether it will work on growth, I mean, just as halving inflation was really all the efforts of the Bank of England and external forces, what is going to happen to the growth performance the next 2 years is largely going to continue to be influenced by those similar things. If inflation were to fall faster to 2%, then the rise in real disposable incomes that would come through would be stronger, that of course would help the consumer. And if investment spending is picking up, then there's a chance growth could be cyclically stronger than they're saying. But against that, and I think I picked up something about a 5% energy cap increase coming in January. If we have further significant cost of living increases being brought in, then there won't be any real scope for consumers to feel better off. So it's not obvious to me that there's a major boost one can be confident to about growth in the near term from this, although, again, going back to my underlying theme, very important things, including some more areas of devolved policies, such as Hull and the East Riding, and centrally to a lot of what I'm involved in, there was bigger powers given to the British Business Bank to be in the centre of a more expansive role of getting pension fund money into the venture capital space and high growth private space. And I think for the longer term, that is really important for the UK.
But, Jim, so do you think they just did what they could? Could they have done more with what they had within the fiscal constraints? Or have they played their hand well?
I think they've played their hand politically cleverly for their own party with some eye-catching things. But it's risky with their framework. Given how much, and again, I've talked to you about this at length, I am not a fan at all. In fact, I'm one of the leading campaigners for a much more sophisticated approach to managing fiscal policy for the long term. But they've imposed this necessity of having it dropping in 5 years' time. But if they really, really believe that, they wouldn't have used any of the fiscal headroom and would have had a much more confident and much clearer decline in the debt to GDP going forward. But because of the politics, and particularly the importance of tax cuts to the right, that's gone by the wayside to some degree.
Jim, overall, I mean, we also have this Global Investment Summit here that Rishi Sunak is hosting on Monday, and there are a number of actually, international investors. Jamie Dimon, we think, is coming, Steve Schwarzman, and others. I mean, what do the international investors think of the UK right now?
I mean, I think they see what is evident, that there is seemingly a never-ending change of ministerial positions in lots of different important industries, different areas. I think there is a sort of a relief-type respect for the current Prime Minister, and especially this Chancellor, in that they seem sort of relatively normal, let's call it, compared with what we've had. But there is a lot of concern that because of the instability of the Tory politics, you never quite know what's going to be around the corner. I think this budget should be seen as designed to try and unify the Tory factions, but because the underlying divisions are so deep, I'm not sure one should have any confidence that that will succeed for too long. But I think by and large, as is obvious, a lot of international business people are more and more interested in what the opposition would have to say and how they would try to run UK economic policy, because there is obviously a reasonable, if not more than reasonable, chance that within not much more than a year from now at the latest, we could have a different government of a different political colour for the first time in 14 years.
Yeah, and we understand and we know actually that Labour has tried to get much closer to business. Like, is there anything that they can offer policy-wise to be seen as even more business-friendly without, turning away from their roots?
Well, I think Keir Starmer's done a pretty good job on steering them through their own sort of mixed factions within the Labour Party. And as you know, I actually led a startup review for Rachel Reeves, so I've got to the heart of how some of their thinking is. And as not covered linked to this, but a few weeks ago, she came out with a statement saying they give the OBR even more powers about major fiscal or spending decisions, which I think is a very wise decision in terms of long-term UK fiscal credibility. But as Rachel knows and her team know, I would like them to go even further and to give the OBR scope to, in the same way they analyse immigration and ageing as to what that does to the long-term fiscal health of the UK, I think they should be getting mandated to look at the top 20 or 30 long-term infrastructure projects that the Independent Infrastructure Commission recommend, so we can really get to grips with public sector investment. Because, of course, one of the things that will dominate this year looking backwards is the utter fiasco over HS2. But it could be any other of long-term investment projects where the UK somehow has allowed its democracy and complicated political process to just make many of these things seemingly impossible, but all of which are vital to boost our long-term investment performance and our productivity.
Jim, I refuse to talk football unless it's with Jim O'Neill and unless it's about Man United. We were expecting a deal on Monday. What do you think the delay is?
Well, I was chairing a Gritstone meeting yesterday with my fellow board members, and I said it's interesting that this is happening on such a big day. And they all thought I meant the autumn statement, but it was actually the one-year anniversary of when the owners claimed they were putting it up for sale. I haven't the slightest idea, other than the fact they never seem to really focus on doing anything in any hurry. And frankly, whether it really makes a big difference, given that they're seemingly going to remain in majority control, let's just say I hope my scepticism can be proved wrong.
I was going to say, what do you think Jim Ratcliffe can actually change with 25%?
Well, according to all the media, he's going to have complete control of the football side, but quite in an entity like Manchester United, how you can supposedly divorce that from the never-ending commercial juggernaut, I have no idea.
All right, Jim O'Neill, our expert on the autumn statement and on football. He, of course, is member of the House of Lords and former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, also former chairman of Chatham House. Jim, as always, thank you for joining us. Coming up, our deep dive into the UK's autumn budget. We'll be joined by the chief economist of the Institute for Government, Gemma Tetlow, to discuss the impact of tax cuts on public services. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. The UK autumn budget's tax cuts risk rebounding the squeeze or redoubling the squeeze on Britain's crumbling public services. Now, the government's own fiscal watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, says the program is severe enough that it's, quote, a significant risk to our forecast. Well, let's bring in Gemma Tetlow, chief economist at the Institute for Government. Gemma, Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, we're still trying to understand exactly whether this is a game changer, what the fiscal implications are this longer term, and also the inflation implications. What's your hot take on what we heard yesterday?
What we heard yesterday was that Jeremy Hunt got, in a sense, a fiscal windfall. That's really coming from higher inflation leading to higher tax revenues. And he essentially gave away all that money in tax cuts. But he only was really able to do that because he chose not to top up any of his public spending plans, despite the fact that we're seeing higher inflation and higher wage increases than were previously expected. So what that means is that public spending, public services are facing a much tighter squeeze on their budgets than was previously expected. We already thought before yesterday's announcements that the numbers penciled in for the next few years, and particularly beyond the next election, look implausible if you really want to deliver the kind of quality and scope of services that the government talks about. And yesterday just made that even more significant. So, for example, he's added in an extra year of spending squeeze into the next election.
So are you more, how political actually was this budget, first of all, and are you more downbeat about the longer term consequences of this in 12 months?
It was clearly a budget targeted at delivering on the idea of tax cuts, which have been called for in parts of the Tory party, but was predicated on really squeezing very tight on public spending. And it seems unlikely that whoever wins the next election will actually see the spending plans that are currently penciled in delivered. But he's really just kicked the can down the road and slightly sort of abdicated responsibility for dealing with problems in public services that are already quite evident by penciling in those spending numbers.
Where do you see the most resilience in the economy, Gemma, and what do you worry about the most?
So it's interesting. I think as Jim O'Neill just talked about in your previous interview, the new measures that were announced yesterday, the Office of Budget Responsibility does think will improve growth. So particularly the national insurance cut boosting employment and the full expensing for businesses, increasing business investment. But at the same time, they are now taking a more gloomy view on some other aspects of the UK's potential for growth. And therefore, actually, the medium to longer term picture for the UK economy net from all of the announcements yesterday was actually somewhat more gloomy. And I guess to sort of make the picture even more troubling, the OBR is still quite significantly more optimistic about growth in the next few years. And certainly the Bank of England, who take a very gloomy view, and even most other independent forecasters are somewhat more gloomy than the OBR. So it was a sort of combination of both what looks relatively optimistic in the OBR forecast compared to others, but at the same time still very grim in terms of the slow rate of economic growth and the weak recovery of household incomes over the next few years.
Gemma, let's also bring Joe Mays from our UK government team. So, Joe, there's a lot of chatter now about a possible May election. What were the clues in it? Or I guess it's because the Chancellor didn't rule out an early budget.
Well, yeah, so he was asked this morning, will you perhaps do an early budget? And Jeremy Hunt said, I haven't made a decision yet. Normally it's in March, but, I'll make a decision at the appropriate time. So he certainly didn't kind of quell that speculation. That payroll tax cuts, national insurance, they announced yesterday, fast tracking it to January. Again, that was the easy clue. Are the Conservatives trying to roll the pitch here by bringing these tax cuts fairly quickly? Perhaps have another early spring budget with more tax cuts announced and then hold a snap vote thereafter. That's the theory amongst some in Westminster. We have the former Cabinet Minister Simon Clarke saying yesterday he expects a May election. So, yes, certainly that talk has grown around whether the Tories are gearing themselves up for that. Obviously, there'll be risks because they are still 20 points behind Labour in the polls, and if you go early, you don't necessarily give yourself time to win back some of that public support. So, yeah, difficult decisions for Sunak to make in the near term.
Thank you both, Chief Economist at the Institute for Government, Gemma Tetlow, and Bloomberg's Joe Mays. Don't go anywhere because both stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Now, still with us, Gemma Tetlow, Chief Economist at the Institute for Government, and Joe Mays from Bloomberg's UK government team. Joe, will the budget yesterday have done anything to help the Tories with the polls, or is it just about unifying the party?
I think there's a chance it will help them, and the press this morning, many of the tabloid papers lead on those tax cuts that Jeremy Hunt announced. There's one of the biggest packages since the 1980s, and that positive sentiment is there. So we'll have to see whether the polls do move. I think within the Conservative Party, MPs were broadly happy with the measures he announced because it is pushing that tax burden. Instead of rising more and more, it's trying to start bringing it down. That's welcome for them. But I think the bigger economic picture, as Gemma was talking about, is still pretty bleak. Those public services cuts that he assumes, if they were to happen, it would be pretty devastating. So I think the broader picture is still pretty unwelcome for the Tories, and there's a lot for them to do to try and claw it back ahead of that election.
Gemma, what's your biggest concern, given what we heard yesterday? Is it NHS, is it public services, or is it something else?
I think the impact on public services is certainly a concern, and also the fact that they are now reducing public investment as a share of national income quite significantly. So whereas they've boosted incentives for private investment, they're doing less public investment, and that is likely to have an impact if that continues. My other concern is about the risk that they're taking by having given away all of the good news yesterday. That means, I think it's both politically and economically risky, because if the forecasts move against them again, which they very easily could, they have very little headroom against their desire to get debt falling as a share of GDP. And so that could mean that if the forecasts do deteriorate, next time they could be scrabbling around looking for further tax rises or spending cuts to try and compensate for that. And as I say, it's both economically undesirable because you don't have the space to accommodate those kind of changes, but also politically dangerous potentially if they don't go to the polls before March. Do a budget and it could be tricky.
Thank you both for joining us. Gemma Tetlow, their Chief Economist at the Institute for Government, and of course our very own Joe Mays from Bloomberg Government. Now be sure to subscribe also to Bloomberg's In the City podcast that I host alongside David Merritt and Allegra Stratton on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every Thursday. This is Bloomberg.